been nearly 20 years, and there's still nothing quite like going on a rampage through Vice City's sun-drenched, neon-lit streets of excess in Grand Theft Auto Vice City, all to the soundtrack of classic 80s music. Oh man, the nostalgia. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. In today's video, I am going over the second video in a three-part series called Buy or Deny, where I talk about all aspects of the game, where I finally reached that fateful decision of whether or not I recommend going out and buying this game or simply skipping it. I may also say wait for a price drop or pick it up once it's been completely patched up. In the previous video discussing GTA 3, the Definitive Edition, I noted that the game had a number of issues pertaining to its graphics, weird bugs, questionable weather effects, and more, and that even though the game had been patched up quite a bit, there was still a lot of room for it to improve. In this video, we are going over Grand Theft Auto Vice City, the Definitive Edition, TM, and discuss if this outing has fared any better than its older brother. Before we get started, please smash that like button to the beautiful sound of my tank as I explode everything in sight, or at least try to. Also, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, because here at Fun My Life, I cover video game content a few times a week, and if that's something you're interested in, I'd love to have you along for the ride. Without further ado, let's get into Buy or Deny Vice City Edition. FML! Grand Theft Auto Vice City was released all the way back in 2002 on the PS2, and was seen as a worthy successor to GTA 3 in nearly every way possible. The game introduced motorcycles for the first time in any 3D GTA game, and also featured a much greater variety of weapons for the player to wreak havoc with. Vice City also had many more polygons added to the game's protagonist and NPCs, further fleshing out the graphical fidelity of the play space. The game's setting is the now iconic Vice City, one of the most beloved backdrops to any open-world game, due in large part to its depiction of the lush and beautiful Miami set in the 1980s. Be prepared to encounter a number of classic 80s cultural references and iconic music, as you'll see everything from the neon-lit Art Deco buildings along the beach to the big hair and larger-than-life personas of the inhabitants that infest the city. Players take control of Tommy Vercetti, a highly dangerous man with a criminal past who ventures to Vice City to oversee a drug trade that goes, well, let's say, quite wrong. Tommy and his boss Sonny, devastated by their humiliating trade going down the toilet, seek to recover the money and drugs they lost, along with building their fortune and infamy of becoming the kingpin of Vice City's criminal underground. Throughout the story, players will come to work with numerous colorful characters that represent the dark and seedy criminal lifestyle that is embellished with 80s flair. The game's story is quite an evolution over GTA 3, as protagonist Tommy Vercetti is a fully voiced character this time around, with ambitions of his own.
Listen to me. The time to take over this town is now. It's all out there waiting for us.
We need to start seizing territory and let Vice City know we're the new players in town. You know what I'm saying?
What you need is a legitimate front, Tommy. Real estate. It's never done me no harm.
Tommy, played by famous actor Ray Liotta, is a dangerous man who is down with anything and everything to advance his position in Vice City as the most powerful man in this sun-soaked metropolis. There are a lot more cutscenes and dialogue in Vice City compared to GTA 3, and this is just one of the many ways that makes GTA Vice City a clear step up over its predecessor. Just over 50% of your way into the story, the game tasks the player with buying up properties that in turn generates wealth for Tommy and grants access to special perks, including exclusive vehicles, gun discounts, and more. By purchasing these properties, Tommy is now in control of that asset, and after completing a series of missions tied to that property, Tommy can visit the property and collect the money as time passes in the game. The properties are numerous, spanning film shoots, boating docks, clubs, taxi companies, and more. Tommy may also buy up real estate in the way of apartments, condos, and houses that grants Tommy extra safe spots throughout the city. GTA Vice City makes the player feel like they are truly taking over Vice City, one property at a time, and it makes for progression through the city and its story all the more satisfying because it constantly rewards the player with fun vehicles and weaponry. Oh, and that money is nice too. Other than the clear upgrades to the story progression over its predecessor, the city of Vice City is really the star of the show here. The city is teeming with personality and style, perhaps even more so than any other game in this franchise, and that's even including the more recent GTA 5. The coconut tree dotted beaches, flamboyant fashion, and perfect purplish pink sunsets perfectly capture a moment of time that was Miami in the 1980s, a time where a lot of crime and drugs ran rampant. But you'd never know because the laid-back and party-like atmosphere painted a facade that radiated throughout every street corner and every beach. The radio stations with their wonderful collections of classic 80s music is a monumental reason why this game still resonates so incredibly well all these years later. Trust me, even if you are only slightly a fan of 80s music, you are going to have a blast, literally, rocking out to these tunes while traversing this beautiful recreation of 80s Miami. It is so sad then that many of the game's most iconic songs, mainly from Michael Jackson, Ozzy Osbourne, Kim Wilde, and more, are missing in this definitive edition of Vice City. This is not something to get mad with the developers about though, as developers need to reacquire the licenses needed to have songs featured in their games. And with an expansive soundtrack such as Vice City's that span dozens upon dozens of songs, getting all the rights back for this edition of the game seemed unlikely. As a result, the vast majority of the songs are still here and sound just as awesome as they did in the original. It's just a shame then that some of the game's most popular and heavy-hitting songs are no longer here. There was nothing quite like listening to Billie Jean as I hijacked a tank and went commando in the crowded streets of downtown Vice City. But enough about that nostalgia and what Vice City was like back on the PS2. What is it like playing Grand Theft Auto Vice City the Definitive Edition on the PlayStation 5? Grand Theft Auto Vice City played nearly identical to GTA 3, and the Definitive Edition of Vice City plays it very safe by mostly adhering to the control scheme of the original. Like GTA 3 Definitive Edition, the Vice City Definitive Edition also uses the same controls that are now uniform across all Grand Theft Auto, the Trilogy, the Definitive Edition TM games. Accelerating and braking while driving a vehicle are all performed with the right and left triggers respectively, while aiming and firing guns are used with the left and right triggers. This makes a huge difference to the ease of the game, as these updated controls now better mimic modern third-person action games as opposed to the now dated controls of the originals that were mainly played using the face buttons. Unfortunately, just like Grand Theft Auto 3, the Definitive Edition, no additional work was put into making the gunplay any more modern than its debut on the PS2. Players can freely aim their guns now, but the target lock-on mechanic, which is essential to play the game well due to the heightened aggression of the enemies, still remains incredibly clunky. Enemies awkwardly rush the player and get up real close to you, bludgeoning you with bullets and blunt weapons as you comically run circles around enemies, hoping your spray of SMG bullets get the best of your enemies. The game plays exactly the same as GTA 3 Definitive Edition, and although it's nice to have every game play uniformly throughout the Definitive Edition trilogy, it speaks more about the absence of enhanced gun mechanics that would have greatly benefited this game. Larger firearms that require two hands to wield also stop the player in his or her tracks, transitioning to an abrupt first-person view where the player must guide a flimsy reticle over enemies. This greatly disrupts the rhythm and flow of combat and leaves the player vulnerable to all sorts of punishment inflicted by Vice City's unruly thugs. During the course of the game, I never ran into too many issues as numerous updates had already fixed the most pressing issues regarding performance and stability. I played the entirety of this game, achieving 100% completion and obtained the Platinum Trophy on the PlayStation 5, and during my 27-hour playthrough, I encountered only one game crash, a huge step up from the 17 crashes I received on GTA 3, the Definitive Edition.
Easy, brother. No cop drives this bad.
Having played mostly on Update 1.03, the game ran considerably better than GTA 3 on its launch patch, meaning the game was a mostly smooth experience with very little bugs that greatly impacted my experience. The only issues that were somewhat noteworthy was the rainfall, and even though it's a big step up from the day one release, would still have a very strange effect when I was in the helicopter. While I was rapidly approaching the ground or the ocean while flying during a rain shower, The rain appeared to be traveling at my speed or a little bit lower, making the effect look like I was achieving zero gravity. This should easily be fixed, as the rain density is a lot lighter, meaning it's not going to blind you like it did at launch. One issue that I ran across was toward the southwest part of the map, where the yellow road navigation line appeared to zigzag in ridiculous ways around one of the ports. I've never seen this issue before, but I was surprised when I saw it and wondered who on earth would take this crazy route when you could simply just cross a street. Now that I think about it, a lot of the navigation assistance that the GTA Trilogy, the definitive edition TM, uses is kinda whack. It's generally very helpful, guiding players to their location without having to pause the game and access the map. However, there are instances when the easiest route would be bypassed completely, and the navigation assistance would lead the character to take detours as to adhere to proper traffic laws. But who follows these traffic laws in GTA? The game still had a lot of AI issues that were very prevalent in the original Vice City on the PS2, like NPCs failing to interact with the right object to progress a mission, certain stunt jumps not registering as being completed after a successful completion, and other minor annoyances. These are a bit difficult to really blame the developers for, as they have essentially kept the original game intact, but let's be honest, it would have been so nice to iron out some of the game's rougher edges. This is, like the game's title claims, the definitive edition of Grand Theft Auto Vice City, and to not see any work done on modernizing these non-graphical aspects of the game is an obvious oversight, especially when you had the modding community do such an incredible job at preserving the identity of GTA Vice City while modernizing it for a modern experience. As the game stands, it is still playable, and that is the most important part of any game. It still feels as clunky and awkward and very much stuck in the early 2000s, and that can be a good thing or a bad thing. It just really depends on how you look at it.
Oh my God.
My expectation of these definitive editions of these classic GTAs was to get something substantial. Something like a Crash Bandicoot the Insane Trilogy or the Demon's Souls remake, where they basically remade the graphics of those games from ground up, polishing their mechanics while completely preserving the feel of those games. The very identities of those classic games were well preserved in their respective quote-unquote definitive editions. This cannot be said for the Grand Theft Auto, the Trilogy Definitive Edition, as the souls of these games were somewhat tampered with, especially at launch with the myriad issues that the game had that completely ruined some of the experiences with its graphical glitches, missing geometry, etc. Just watch my previous video on GTA 3, the Definitive Edition, where I played the entirety of that game right when the trilogy released. Here in Vice City, the bulk of the issues were already ironed out, thanks to the patches that were released post-launch. But I am still pretty confident that many of the issues that I experienced in GTA 3, the Definitive Edition, were just as prevalent here at launch too. Because I didn't play Vice City Definitive Edition at launch, I won't make the claim that this game was also as great of a mess, but the Definitive Edition of Vice City is still far from perfect as well. But just because it isn't perfect doesn't mean that I did not have a good time with it. In fact, I absolutely loved my time with Grand Theft Auto Vice City, the Definitive Edition. I was happy to complete it 100%, even though this wasn't the game that I thought I was going to get. I am completely okay with the art style for the most part, as it mostly captures the PS2 era of games with their aesthetic and character without feeling like a complete modern remake with incredible volumetric lighting and particle effects. I grew up in my teens playing this game just a few years after it had come out, and I loved it back then. Here, I basically kind of love it just the same, so if that's any indicator of whether or not this game is good, let that speak for itself. However, I can only speak for myself, and there are many younger gamers out there who have never played the original Vice City simply because they perhaps weren't old enough or weren't even born yet. Different people have different standards, and for those coming in expecting GTA 5 levels of fidelity and controls will be sorely disappointed with this title. I would have loved to see more effort put into the mechanics of this game, as I believe that this aspect of the game is the one that deserves the most attention. The graphical upgrade is nice, and I think it works well, but perhaps I would have liked maybe a little bit more polish in some areas with the graphics to make it feel like a clear step over its PS2 origins. In the end, GTA Vice City, the Definitive Edition, has clearly been worked on and patched up with its updates, and even though players will still encounter some bugs and issues, this is more or less a pretty solid return to Vice City. It wasn't what most people were hoping it was going to be, a definitive edition of a game that increased its visual flair while completely modernizing its mechanics, animations, and everything that felt dated about the original. Well, we just didn't get that here with this game, and it would take a whole lot more updates to get to that point. It surely is not perfect, nor was this definitive edition enough to be called the definitive edition in the first place, but what we have here is sure to delight most gamers and is still fun for fans of the franchise to pick up and enjoy as we wait for GTA 6, if it will ever come out. Because the numerous updates have put it more on par with the original game, I ultimately recommend playing Grand Theft Auto Vice City the Definitive Edition to players who are truly itching for more GTA content and to those who enjoyed Vice City on the PS2. If you don't fit into one of those groups, then I would have to say wait for this game to hit the bargain bin or wait for the title to receive even more updates to truly iron everything out. Because this is buy or deny, where I have to truly make my final verdict, it all comes down to waiting for this game to be completely patched up and working in tip-top condition, a condition that has not yet been met. Although it inches closer to that finished product that we should have gotten at launch, it simply isn't there yet, giving the Grand Theft Auto Vice City the Definitive Edition a deny. That being said, go out and get the game if you are itching for more GTA content and if you are a fan of Vice City and its other PS2 era games.
Bro, you! It is my favorite El Burro movie, it's time. What else can I do?
Just be prepared not to be blown away by much of anything yet. The new graphics are nice, but some modernization of the mechanics and animations would go a long way at making this return to Vice City a return you surely would never forget. So, what did you think of my verdict? Did you buy GTA the Trilogy, the Definitive Edition, or did you skip it? Let me know what your thoughts are, as I would love to hear about what you have to say about Vice City and other games in the collection. Were you hoping for more of an update to the gameplay mechanics like I was? Or are you happy with just a graphical overhaul with some tighter controls? While I've still got your attention, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, as I've got many more videos coming very soon. Like always, treat yourselves well, have a wonderful day, and FML!